Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbyville. Last time on Veterans of the Valley, we started the story of service of Major General Thomas G. Darling of College Station. You heard of his experiences as a pilot of the B-36 and the B-52, the harrowing days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and his 46 combat missions into Vietnam. Vietnam was almost over, but his career of military service had barely begun, a career that ended where it started, at Texas A&M, when Thomas Darling, Aggie class of 54, became Commandant of the Corps of Cadets. We welcome back General Thomas Darling to Veterans of the Valley. Sort of in more review, we'll talk about that you were born, you grew up in Abilene, you came to Texas A&M in 1950, played on that 50-51 basketball team. You finished in 1954, you wanted to fly, you went to Arizona for flying school and eventually got into the B-36s and the B-52s. That sort of catches us up with where we were. You talked about your experiences with the Cuban Missile Crisis and having to fly the B-52 on those 24-hour missions. And I think when we last visited with you, we had gotten you to Vietnam. Let's sort of start back there again. You were a B-52 pilot in Vietnam, stationed out of Guam.
Yes, we deployed as the entire unit from Turner Air Force Base to Guam, a 17-hour mission. And I remember how hot and humid it was when we stepped off that plane, and I thought, wow, this is going to be tough. But anyway, we were quickly thrown into the schedule. In fact, the very next night, my crew flew a mission. We had some people with us to look over our shoulder to make sure we did everything right. That was a 12-and-a-half-hour mission. That was a typical mission out of Guam to Vietnam and back.
Because that required a refueling, just the flight
Yes,
to Vietnam, right?
It did. We would take off usually in the early morning hours, somewhere 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and flying in 3-ship cell formations, usually 15 to 18 airplanes. And we would fly up toward Okinawa, and we'd each refuel from a tanker, take on probably 100,000 pounds or more, and then head toward Vietnam. Most of our missions were in South Vietnam. Most of them were saturation kind of bombing, where one airplane could cover an area, say, 3 miles long and 1 mile wide. But the missions were long and grueling. We would be up several hours before takeoff doing mission planning, target study. We'd have the briefings of where we were supposed to strike. We wouldn't know till we got to the briefing. But then certain crew members had an individualized study that they had to perform, but then we'd all meet, the chaplain would lead a prayer, and we'd go out to the airplane and in the night and get ready to launch. And coasting into Vietnam, we generally put on flak vests and all of that. As I said, most of our missions were in South Vietnam. We did make these 2 missions into North Vietnam shortly after I got there to try to fill in this Mugia Pass and stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail from resupplying South Vietnam. But the schedule required that usually about every 3rd day you would launch on one of these missions. A mission day, a 12-and-a-half-hour mission, plus all the pre-flight, the mission study, and then the debriefing after you get back. They went into great effort to debrief us on each mission. So it made a long day, and you were ready for the sack. But no, as soon as you woke up, you're about ready to go on another one like this. So that's what I did for repeatedly there in 1966.
The Vietnam War is one that will be debated in history books for as long as there is time, I'm sure. And you said that, you told me earlier that fighting the Vietnam War, because of the politics of it all, sometimes you felt like you were fighting with one arm behind your back. Sort of explain about that.
Well, we did. You know, we thought we could end this war pretty quickly. I think that was the feeling when we got in, but it went on year after year, and you know, we all know the history of that. But there was times when we would step up our activity. Bombing would be a little more intense and go a little deeper. Then we'd back off hoping for a response, which never really came, I don't think. And it wasn't until the fall, till really the Christmas time, 1972, that we did launch an all-out effort. I think there were roughly 130 B-52s at Guam and in Thailand at that time, and all of those were put into the effort there in what we call the 11-day war, starting on 18 December. And they launched, and we took some pretty heavy losses in that. But by the 26th of December, the North Vietnamese had run out of missiles and everything else, and their defenses were gone.
Right.
But on the 26th of December, I believe it was the day that they decided they were ready to talk again.
Right.
So I think it was the first time in the war, at least from the Strategic Air Command standpoint, that we were unleashed to do our thing, and it didn't take 10 days really to get some action.
Right, right. So the actions that you were involved in definitely were involved in their decision to start talking.
I think so.
Exactly.
There was other airplanes and other weapon systems involved in that. I wouldn't put it all on the B-52, but it had the major, carried the major load there in those last days.
It was an intimidating aircraft. There's no
It
doubt
was.
about it. I've talked to combat pilots before that have told me that if they were to list the three things that most concerned them when they were flying, they would talk about weather, they'd talk about mechanics, and they'd talk about the enemy. And some even put them in that order as things that most concerned them when flying. You had some pretty hairy episodes with weather, one going back to Guam. Talk about
Right.
that. Yeah.
Weather was always a factor out in the Pacific. The time I was there, we got into the so-called rainy season, just rained all the time, but clouds would bubble up in no time, but typhoons would come through. And I mentioned our tankers were evacuated on that one mission from Okinawa to avoid a big typhoon coming that way, but always having to dodge weather. And I remember one mission coming back, we were maybe 300 miles out of Guam, and the report was that the weather was getting extremely poor. And it was too late to launch a tanker at that point, and we were pretty much committed to having to land at Guam. And that was some of the roughest weather and one of the most harrowing approaches and landings I've ever made in any airplane. We were in formation trying to keep from running into each other. We're in trail formation, and we had to monitor the airplane in front of you, his altitude and speed and all of that, and keep your spacing. And when you're doing that in thick, heavy, bouncing weather, it's not easy. But anyway, I was able to get down to the landing pattern altitude and couldn't see a thing. The rain was just pounding on the airplane. The wind was a direct crosswind, and I had to crank in maximum crosswind crab into this B-52, which has a unique system. The nose of the airplane is pointing into the wind, sort of, but the wheels are aligned with the runway. So you're looking out the side window almost to go down the runway, but still couldn't see anything, and it was a 300-foot ceiling, which we finally were able to break out and sight the runway, and the rain was just pouring down, just hammering us, and was able to get the airplane down and safely, and I never felt such a relief in my life as I did landing the airplane that day, knowing that I had a expensive airplane and a crew of 6 and all that I was responsible for.
Yes, sir. I would imagine. We need to move on past Vietnam and continue with your career. You went from Vietnam, you went to the SAC headquarters, I believe, in Omaha, there for 4 years, promoted to lieutenant colonel. And then eventually you were at Navy War College. Here's an Air Force guy that was going to serve some time with the Navy. That's
right. I knew I'd been selected based on my promotion to lieutenant colonel to go to one of the senior service schools. Well, I assumed it would be the Air Force War College down at Maxwell Air Force, Alabama. But I had a call one day from a good friend down at the Military Personnel Center in San Antonio, and he said, "Tom, how do you like ships?" And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "I like ships fine." He says, "Well, think again, guess again." What he was trying to tell me was I'd been selected to go to the Naval War College. I did get orders to go there. I was very surprised. Had no dealings with the Navy, didn't understand the lingo and all of that, but I did go to the Naval War College, and along with about, I think, 16 other Air Force officers. They brought us in a week and gave us a tour on a submarine, a destroyer, and they couldn't have been nicer to us. And I had a great year at a very distinguished place there at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island.
So it was something you weren't too sure about, but then it became really a thrilling time in your life, didn't it?
It was.
I went on to the Pentagon in 1972, more of a sort of a political type job as a personal plans officer, where you met some, you were working for some folks that were a little rough for you.
Well,
quickly sort of tell that story.
Okay, this is 1972, I guess it was.
Yes, sir.
I came out of the Naval War College, and I was assigned to personnel plans in on the air staff at the Pentagon. And I'd talked to people about it, and they told me kind of what I would be doing. My job would be to help develop some permanent grade legislation for the Air Force. We didn't have permanent grades since the Air Force had been established as a separate service. We'd have to go back each year with temporary legislation. And they wanted to get beyond this. So that was going to be one of my duties in that job. Well, I'd been there about 2 or 3 weeks, and I had a call from the Director of Personnel's office saying that I should come up the next day and meet with the general, the 3-star general, who was the head guy for Air Force personnel, human resource, if you would, resources. So I go up at 10 o'clock the next morning and check in with his secretary, and she tells me to take a seat. They're having a meeting in his office there that's been extended a little bit. So I wait and wait, 10:30, 11, 11:30. The door never opened. They're still in there. So I knew it must be a kind of a brutal meeting going on in there to be that long. Well, about 11:50, the secretary says, well, you might as well go back to your office. We'll reschedule you. It's not going to happen. About that time, the door opens, and I see a half a dozen really whip-looking guys coming out of a meeting. Obviously, the briefing had gotten to them pretty much. They had a pretty hard charge, I could tell. And she says, wait a minute. Says, let me check with the general. He may want to see you. Well, she did. Came back and said, yeah, he would want to see you. Says, just push the door open and go on in. Well, I pushed the big white door open and go into this huge office, and there's his big desk, and he's got his head buried in the stuff on his desk, and I move in front of his desk, and I'm ready to salute him as soon as he will look up. He never looks up at me. He just keeps going, and finally he barks something at me and never looks at me. And, you know, I try to salute him or something, and he proceeds to start asking me a bunch of tough questions, like, Colonel, what do you think your job is? And I tried to tell him, and he didn't think I knew very well what my job was, so he was going to help me a little bit, I think. But he was really there to put a little fear in me, I think. I told him about this grade legislation thing I'd be working on. He said, let me tell you, Colonel, you better get that passed this year. You better get it passed. And then he stands up and he puts his finger right on my chest, and he says, Colonel, let me tell you, if you don't get that passed, you just think of the worst place in the world I can send you, and that's where I'm sending you. I mean, you know, steely-eyed and all. And I said, yes, sir. And he dismissed me, and it ruined my whole weekend, of course. But I got to know this man better. He went on to make 4 stars. He's a brilliant man, but he had this way of dealing with people through fear. And, you know, it worked.
Indeed it did. We're gonna move forward rather quickly now, because I want to get to your time at Texas A&M. You spent 2 years as a wing commander. You went to the SAC headquarters in a staff job. Spent 18 months there. You went to school actually at the University of Pittsburgh. You as a management school there, executive training. Promoted to Brigadier General at about this time, Director of Personnel for SAC for 3 years. The resume just goes on and on, folks. It really does. You went to this mid-career school in joint operations there. It became a component of the Air Defense University. Talk a little bit about what that was.
Okay, after completing a tour at SAC, I was surprised to find I was going to the Armed Forces Staff College to be the Commandant, or the head of the school, sort of the president, if you would, which is a very distinguished mid-career school, primarily to teach joint planning, joint operation. When I signed in there in Norfolk, Virginia, beautiful campus, most prestigious place, My boss was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But within a week, I had a message saying that there was a restructuring going on. They were going to create the National Defense University, which would include 3 component schools. My school, the Armed Forces Staff College, the National War College, and the Industrial College, both located in Washington. So that's the way we were organized there. I reported to a boss in Washington. Went up there every week for staff meetings. But it was an opportunity for me as commandant of that school to, much as when I'd been a wing commander, to use my own initiative and try my leadership skills and test out some of the training and ideas that I had. It was a great tour for me. Wonderful students, most of them with masters, some of them with PhDs, highly motivated, but really a plum of an assignment. We had speakers from all throughout the military, top people from universities, other places. Just a wonderful experience there at the Armed Forces Staff College. Some of the students that were mine then were majors, lieutenant colonels, and many of those went on to make general and 4-star general even.
Right. Went to California as a vice commander of the 15th Air Force, 2 years there. Got to fly a U-2. We'll see a picture of that here in a moment. Back to Norfolk as the Deputy Commander-Chief of the U.S. Atlantic Command, where your boss there was a 4-star admiral, right?
Yes, I was selected to go back to sort of be with the Navy, if you would. I lived on a Navy installation. Mm-hmm. I was the Deputy Commander for one of the unified commands, U.S. SINC-LANT, primarily a maritime command. Mm-hmm. My boss was a 4-star admiral. He was a wonderful fellow to work for. Treated me very well, gave me a lot of good opportunities. One time he had to be out of country and he sent me to Washington to testify before the one of the Senate subcommittees, which scared the daylights out of me. I mean, you worked pretty hard for a couple of weeks to get ready for one of those.
Indeed. I want to move on because I need to get you to Texas A&M. We never have enough time on these shows, but you were actually serving back at Norfolk again, and you got a letter from a gentleman named John Coldis at Texas A&M saying that they were looking for a Commandant of the Corps. And that's what eventually brought you to Texas A&M. Sort of reflect on that time and your decision to come back to your alma mater to work.
Well, I was surprised to hear from John Coldis. He explained to me that A&M was looking to hire their own commandant. It was a little bit of a change from what they'd had before. Normally the Army professor of military science and tactics served as the commandant as well, but they wanted their own commandant apparently. And they were contacting various people, and they wanted to know if I would be interested in being a candidate. Mm-hmm. After some exchange of information, and he came up to visit me, I came down here, and ended up I was selected for that job. And I went in to see my 4-star admiral to tell him about it. I had 2 more years before mandatory retirement, and I was kind of torn whether I wanted to come back to A&M then or serve my last 2 years. But he told me he thought I had a great opportunity, and he'd give his blessings to me coming to A&M. So that summer, I'd retired from the Air Force after 33 years and did come to Texas A&M.
August of 1987 that was. This is a good time to stop and let's look at some photographs that we have. And before we wrap this up, let's go to some pictures that belong to General Darling. Talk about this picture real quick.
Well, this was when I was assigned to March Air Force Base as 15th Air Force Commander in 1985-86. Mm-hmm. We were receiving the new KC-10 cargo tanker plane. It was a military version of the DC-10. And the people at McDonnell Douglas would roll out about 1 a month, and they'd invite a senior officer to come over and fly the airplane out. So this is one of the vice presidents there shaking hands with me, and that's the airplane behind me was a brand new airplane, and I got to make the first takeoff and refueling with this aircraft.
Okay, let's move on. This is with the
while
U-2.
I was at 15th, we were responsible for most of the reconnaissance assets in the Air Force, the U-2 being one of them. This is the one that identified the Soviet missiles in Cuba and done a lot of other great work for many years, but they felt I should have the opportunity to experience U-2. So I went up. That's my instructor there. At the bottom shows us taking off. At the top picture is after the flight, and we're walking away from the airplane, but we had to wear that full pressure suit, and we did get above 70,000 feet that day, and
wow.
It was a great experience. It gave me a great appreciation for what that airplane can do.
That comes close to making you an astronaut, almost. What are we looking at there?
This is back at Norfolk when I was leaving the Armed Forces Staff College. That is me in the white uniform. We did have a white uniform back in those days.
Right.
That's General Norm Anderson there, a Marine, but he's presenting me the MacArthur Medallion. He was with the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, and we'd established a very close relationship with that organization there at the Staff College. They seemed to appreciate all that I'd done and help promote the name of MacArthur and do things for Mrs. MacArthur, and they presented me that gold medallion, which is a gold, heavy gold medallion that's struck by Congress, and it's only been presented to a few people, I understand.
I know that's a great honor. There's just a photograph of you a little bit later with in your uniform. Wanted to show folks that picture. Let's go ahead and move on. We've got a couple of others. There's you and 3 other Aggies.
Well, this happened about 5 years ago. There was a base out near the Colorado Springs. It's now known as Schriever Air Force Base.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't have that name at the time, but it was to be renamed in honor of General Schriever. General Schriever is the third one from the left in this picture. He died a year or so ago. He was well up into his 90s, but I got to know this man. He's an Aggie. He is the father of the Space and Missile Forces for the United States, a brilliant man. That's Mr. Pete Aldridge on his right, who was former Secretary of the Air Force. Pete's a class of 1960, I believe it was, but he's held other high positions. That's Major General Frank Watson there in the blue suit. He was out there, and then that's me in the civilian clothes there on the left. But we were all there together to participate in this renaming of the base, the Schriever Air Force Base.
All right, let's move on. Now, we're going to go ahead and talk about this now while the picture is up. Among the things that you were involved in when you were the Commandant of the Corps is that you had the vision and led the funding effort for the Sam Houston Sanders Corps of Cadets Center. Certainly a wonderful, wonderful facility that's on campus right now. I know that this is a place that's very close to your heart.
Well, it is. I'm very proud of this and still can't believe the opportunity we had to develop the support and the funding and all for this facility. When I came to A&M in '88, it seemed to me we really didn't have an adequate place in the Corps of Cadets to take visitors, to display our proud history. A lot of things we couldn't do because we didn't have an appropriate place. And it was at a Corps Development Council meeting my first year that I briefed that distinguished group that is my vision within 10 years that we might have some kind of facility that would be a combination visitor center, headquarters, meeting rooms, could display all of our flags and symbols and all of that. And I kind of outlined what I had in mind. And again, my thought was maybe in 10 years we might have something like that. Well, that evening at a social hour, one of those fellows that I'd briefed that afternoon, Mr. Harvey Cash, a very distinguished Aggie class of 33, came up to me and said, "Tom," says, "you know, you're right on this building." He says, "We need it, but we need it a lot sooner than what you're talking." He says, "I'm prepared to give $100,000 to help get this started." And he says, "I want to call in some of these gentlemen, and we're going to see if we can raise $500,000 here in the next few minutes."
Yes, sir.
Well, sure enough, he called in several there, and in no time we had a large sum of money committed to this project. And I realized right then my idea was, could take off. So we started briefing people around campus, facilities and planning. General Ed Peel bought into this completely over at facilities and planning. And we proceeded, we got an architect, designed the building, found the location, and we even had a line of credit from the A&M Foundation. But we never had to borrow a dime to finish this building. The contributions rolled in.
This is you and your wife, Evelyn. You lost your wife this past December, but I know that she had an awful lot to do with your career and the building of this facility.
Well, she did. She was a great partner and stood by me on everything, went with me to all A&M functions and dinners and everything that we had. But that's a bench right there that was done in our honor. One of our supporters did that. There's another one over there that's also done in our honor. But we're very privileged to have been here and been a part of that Corps Center project.
The gentleman there with the sword is Tyson Vocal, who I've had a guest on this show, Veterans of the Valley. Tyson was the Corps commander when you were here, and a young man that you and I both have a lot of respect for. And that's him talking to you. Tell him about the honor that he was sort of giving you right there.
Well, that was a surprise to me. This is final review, and Tyson walks up to me and said, "Sir, I think you ought to lead the troops around this time. Since you're retiring, I want to give you that honor." Well, that was overwhelming to me. I had not suspected that at all, but he's explaining that to me right there. And I did end up leading the Corps in that final parade that year. That was 1996. This is that same final review. That's Dr. Ray Bowen and Dr. Malin Sutherland and myself there sawing the horns off during that.
Wonderful, wonderful pictures. We just have about a minute left. Sort of wrap up your 9 years as the Commandant of the Corps of Cadets. I know it's just a time that went by, but a time that's very, very meaningful to you.
Well, it was. I didn't know all I was getting into when I came here, but I put myself into it and tried to do some things I thought were appropriate. One, we integrated the units to include women.
Right.
Controversial move. Built the Corps Center. We put a strong emphasis on academics. We didn't feel that we were doing well enough, and it was clear to me that that had to be our #1 priority, and I'm pleased to say that for several years now that has been a #1 priority and done well. Raising scholarships, funding the Corps was a big priority, and we've just done remarkable things since then.
All right. We are out of time. I'm sorry. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for your service.
Thank you. My pleasure.
For 46 years, Thomas Darling wore a military uniform, and he admits that it was difficult to take it off for the last time. Suffice it to say, his impact on those that he served and with and served under him, and the gift of leadership he gave back to the school he loved so dearly, are immeasurable indeed. We salute General Thomas Darling as we do all veterans. I'm Tom Turbeville. Join us next time on Veterans of the Valley.